Guys, welcome to another episode of Pivot Well by Sarah. I decided I'm going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to do a series, and I'm going to call it Flipping Tables. Why I'm calling out corruption in the church and why Jesus did too. I want to talk about that because I think that's important right now, given the current climate of politics and faith. Every month, there's another headline about a pastor, a church, or a ministry that's wrapped up in scandal, money, abuse, power, politics. Like I see it everywhere I go right now, and it's exhausting. Everyone's asking the same questions. Like, what is Christianity? What's happening? And where is God amongst all of this? And honestly, it's a fair question to ask because it feels really grim right now, to say the least. And here's the truth. Honestly, Jesus himself confronted corrupt leaders when he was on earth, specifically corrupt religious leaders. That was actually a big target of his criticism while he was here. He flipped tables while he was teaching the disciples. Jesus was braiding the whip that he would later go to the temple, flip the tables and whip. Why did he do this? Let's talk about that story for a second. What was the whole premise behind him coming into the temple and flipping it? At the surface, if you read the scripture, it talks about they were buying and selling within the temple. And we think, well, it's because they were buying and selling. And that is one part of why Jesus would have gone in there. It was desecrating the temple, God's house, like the place where you were supposed to go worship and connect with God. As Christians, it would be like buying and selling within our sanctuary, which I actually don't agree with for this exact story. But this is, again, the surface thing. To take it a step further, Jesus would have known what was going to happen in the future, right? God knew what the state of the church and the world would look like in 2025. He knew that churches would become a source of income, a stream of income. And everything that Jesus did on earth was intentional. He was led by God to do things intentionally. And I think he was led to the temple to flip the tables, to whip those who were participating in this, to show he did not agree with that. I think he would agree with a church having $50 billion under their denomination. There's something seriously wrong with all of this. Jesus came to show us how to live, and he came to expose the hypocrisy of the current state of the church during that time. I have been seeing on the news all the things that are going on, and I'm sure many of you have, but I don't want to get too deep into the wrong part of the message of this and why I decided to make this podcast. Jesus' time on earth, during the documentation of his time on earth, that was not the primary focus. And I don't want that to become my primary focus. But I do want to talk about it because I think it's relevant. So today we're starting a new series, and we're going to discuss why I personally want to flip tables in some modern churches. So I want to make this very clear. This isn't an attack on God. This isn't an attack on faith. And it is absolutely not an attack on Christianity or trying to tear down Christianity. I am a Christian. Cling to that. I cling to being a Christian and following Jesus. But I have to look at what's going on in the world and think, what is our job as Christians in the midst of all of this? And I think it has to be, first of all, we have to separate Jesus from the corruption that is being done in his name. Because that's essentially what's happening. A lot of these things are being done in the name of Jesus, and it is hurting a lot of people. And if we don't stand up for him, even the rocks will cry out. I spent a lot of time praying, and I asked God to guide me in what he would want me to do with this. And I hope that this is something that brings him glory, and I hope it might be affirming to some who might be victims of this and maybe shed a different light on this from a different perspective, from a Christian who actually genuinely loves God and never wants to be caught in the middle of the temple that had the tables flipped. I want to confront it head on, and I want to try and encourage all of us as Christians to restore the true Great Commission, strip the politics and the power away from it, and not get caught up in our own personal agendas, because I am absolutely angry and I have my own feelings about a lot of things going on, but we are called to be bigger. So what does that look like? Now, to start, let's address the headlines that we can't ignore because they're everywhere. And again, the goal of this podcast is not to skirt around what's going on, it's to face it head on and try to change perspectives to a more Christian focused perspective. You don't have to look far to see these stories. If you are paying attention, you likely know about churches that have been caught with scandals. There have been many big churches that have made the news, especially I would say the last couple of years, but I know I've seen quite a few this year alone. And there are celebrity pastors who are being exposed. I see it on TikTok, on YouTube. Like you could just Google the amount of money in some of these churches and you're just like flabbergasted at that amount of wealth. I think another story that I find extremely disheartening is the woman who is doing the formula test where she's calling different churches and asking if they can help her get formula for her child. Now, I do want to say, I always try to use discretion with this. Obviously, the world is a stage, right? And we never know what's going on. I can see, though, that this might be true in some circumstances where I think her point was kind of like the bigger churches are the ones that are less likely to do this. I don't know how many calls they're getting, but I also feel like if you are a church who has millions, even more than that in your possession and you can't help someone who calls or needs help, I find that extremely disheartening. I love to hear that the smaller churches are helping or more likely to help because it's often with fame and power and wealth comes pride. My biggest pet peeve, if I were to like say there's one thing that I look for in a person who I don't trust, it's an ego, arrogance that every relationship I've ever had that's failed, whether it be personal, like my family, my friends, past significant others, the ones that have always failed over some form of pride. And it's no different within the church. I hate to see these pastors that stand up there who are very proud and boastful, but I don't think it's fair to say that that's every church. It is clearly the ones who have been using the Lord's name in vain. When I was a kid, I used to think, thou shalt not take the Lord thy God's name in vain, right? I was always taught to not say, oh my God, and that's taking the Lord's name in vain. And so it took me a really long time to understand the depth of that commandment. It is much deeper than just not saying, oh my God. It's not using the Lord's name in vain. If there is a way you are using his name out of context, out of what it should be used for, if you are using his name in your political campaign, if you are using his name to make more money, you are using his name in vain and you are breaking a 10th commandment, which was written in stone for a reason. Clearly, we know there's misuse of funds and laundering within these churches. There's also a deeper element of taking the Lord's name in vain. I'm seeing his name being used to spiritually manipulate people, politically manipulate people, and it's making a web that's so intricate and deep that you can't tell whether you're at a church service, listening to a podcast, or on a campaign rally. We're losing a separation of church and state. And I never want to personally be caught using God's name for my own personal gain, because I think that is exactly the epitome of using the Lord's name in vain. And the problem with this is when that happens, that's how people start to lose trust. Because you have someone, whether it be a podcaster, a politician, or a corrupt pastor who is using God's name and saying these things, and then they're doing the exact opposite, or they are hurting people, they are abusing their congregation or their followers or whoever it might be under the name of God. And that's when people start to lose trust in God. And unfortunately, it's hard to differentiate the two when you have someone who is spiritually manipulating you. And I think that's why I want to make this podcast, to make a very clear distinction between there's difference of being hurt and let down by a church who is claiming God's name and God himself, because those are two very different things. And those who are using his name in vain will pay for what they've done. They will. I would love a front row seat to it as well, because it's getting out of hand. But I think that's why conversation is really important and matters. And it's not just to be had from the people who are calling it out. I think it's also important to hear the victims of these situations and have conversations with them, because ultimately, I would rather help them. You can't help a corrupt man. Only God can change a person once they've gone so far. And I don't even want to try. I would plead and implore with some of these pastors who might still have an ounce of their faith to realize what they're doing and understand that they're playing with fire. But I can't, pride is, like I said, you can't argue with someone who has pride. Like, you have to know when their own God, which is sometimes themselves and their power, or their own arrogance, will always stand in the way of logic and reason, which is why I think Jesus, again, was very intentional about who he was harsh with and who he was compassionate and gracious with. You can see many stories, many comparisons of people who were doing really bad things, but they had a good heart, like Mary Magdalene. Jesus was very gracious with her because her heart was good. She had just been misled and had gone down the wrong path. Parallel that, though, to how he treated the Pharisees. They got the treatment that they deserved because they knew better. They knew better. And they chose to do it under the guise of taking the Lord's name in vain. They chose to do it while taking God's name in vain. And they were responsible for many people losing their walk with God. And again, I wouldn't want to be under that category. I would never want to be the reason somebody loses their walk with God or their faith in God, because ultimately it's really hard to recover somebody's trust when it's been broken, and it's broken by people who are trying to speak on behalf of God, but with their own personal agendas. And I'm very much a believer in God being more gracious and compassionate than we are. He knows our hearts. He knows their hearts. When it comes to judgment, the judgment of every man, my grandfather used to talk about how God was called a judge for a reason, because when you go to court, there is obviously the law, and then there is your case that is presented. And there are times when a judge might say, yes, they broke the law, but the circumstances around it kind of prove that it was not a malicious intent. And then there are times where people intentionally premeditate, break the law, and they deserve the consequences they get. And God will be the same way. He's going to look at every man's case and he's going to evaluate it. And Jesus is doing everything he can to get us into heaven. Let's make that very clear. Jesus is the best lawyer you can have on your side. Give him something to work with, though. And for those of you who have been a victim of the abuse on the receiving end of these churches, God understands. And I pray that someone can come along in your path that can help you come back to the heart of what the church is, which is God. It's not the church. You can take out the word of that. Actually, bring you back to the heart of Christianity, of your faith, and that is in God. You cannot trust man. You cannot trust a building, an entity that is created by corruption, but you can trust that God in the midst of it is trying to find you, and don't shut that door on him. I know people in my own life that I have these conversations with, and I think I'm passionate about this because I've seen the results of people who have been a victim of this. And as someone who grew up in an abusive environment, I understand the desire to hold every single person involved in this accountable, but make sure you can separate the offender from God. We think that God should be able to just wave a magic wand and change things. That's not how this earth is, unfortunately. I don't claim to understand everything. I'm not omnipotent. I'm not all-knowing. But I know that I've had bad things happen to me, but God has never left my side throughout them. And there's the consequence of free will. And, you hear this. And this earth is not our home. So you're not going to have a perfect circumstance on this earth. And that's including in your church, in your, wherever you choose to worship. But despite the evil people, the evil things that are in your life, God is clawing his way through it, trying to get you out on the other side. This is a very temporary blip in eternity, our time on earth. And we aren't promised ever, not once in the Bible, that it's going to be easy, but we are promised for whoever believes in me will not perish, but have everlasting life. And that life will look so different than this one on earth. So I just pray that you are able to separate those two things. And sorry, I went on a little tangent there, but I am passionate about that because I know people who have been victims of religious trauma, and it's sickening. I do want to talk about, though, the wealth in modern churches. Money itself isn't inherently evil. Ministries cost money. Churches need money to keep their lights on, to, pay their pastors and those who dedicate their entire profession to the churches. The early churches shared everything they had, so every expense should be utilized for God's glory. When pastors start looking like celebrities, when they're buying airplanes and they're buying multiple cars and these big, huge mansions, and it's not through maybe family wealth or through wise investments, when that is a direct tie to your congregation's generous giving, you're stealing from God. And there are stories in the Bible. There was a story of Elisha healed Naaman from leprosy, and Naaman was wanting to give the gifts to Elisha for healing. And he said, "No, I don't want to take anything." But Elisha's servants, after they leave, they go back and say, "Actually, my master changed his mind. We will take the silver and clothing." And of course, Naaman gave it because he was super grateful to Elisha and God for healing him. So they took the goods and hid them, pretending nothing had happened. And when Elisha confronted them and exposed their lie, they were struck by Naaman's leprosy. So essentially, Elisha was doing something for God in God's name, healing Naaman of the leprosy. And he didn't want anything in return, because as Christians, we don't do things for what we get out of them. You don't have a church for the profits you make from that church. But the servant wanted to get the profit. He was so focused on the profits. He had just seen a miracle happen. He had just seen a man cured from leprosy right in front of his eyes. The first thing he thought afterward was, "You know what? Actually, we should take that silver and gold. Let's go get that money." Goes back and says, "Actually, Elisha changed his mind. He does want payment." And so, under the guise of a servant of God, he takes the money with the wrong intention and lies about it. And he was struck by leprosy. And I really, really wish I could be there when these people who are taking God's name in vain, who are taking the funds that people are giving in the name of God on their convictions, and they're using them for their own profit. I wish I could see the consequences that will inevitably happen when you abuse God's followers in a vulnerable state. And that's exactly what we saw there. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. We're seeing manipulation under the name of God, and then the misuse of people's generosity. And it makes me want to flip a table. That's why I'm making this podcast. I just would love to go in there and cause a scene like Jesus did. So I'm making this podcast to metaphorically flip the tables, because every single one of you who are misusing God for your gain, there will be a punishment. You've crossed the line from ministry to marketing. And just like Elisha's servant was struck with leprosy, and just like Jesus went and whipped those men and flipped those tables, this is where we'd flip some tables as Christians. And if you are a part of these churches and you are aware that your church is doing this, it's time to call sin by its rightful name. And on that same note, obviously, it's easy to see when churches are misusing God's name, because it's very evident. Okay, you are a pastor and you are flying around in a jet and you are driving G-Wagons and you are, all of this. And then it gets blurry when you look at politicians who are also doing the exact same thing, and they get away with it because they're just sneakily putting God's name into their political speeches. And of course they have money and they are wealthy and they've got donors and they've got all of this. It's a little bit easier to blur the lines there, which is why it's a really dangerous game to use God's name in vain as a politician. I am seeing way too many political figures on the internet, on X, throwing around Bible verses for their own gain because they think they can manipulate people with faith. It makes me, again, want to flip a table. Like, you're coming in and picking something that's a vulnerable thing. People's faith is a vulnerable thing. And you're going to exploit that by saying, you should believe this way because insert Bible verse. You should think this way because insert Bible verse. And let's be clear, Bible verse used out of context. And do you know who else used Bible verses out of context? Satan. When he was tempting Jesus, he could throw around the Bible verses too. And it's important as Christians to know our Bible like Jesus knew the scriptures, because we have to be able to rebuttal that and stand firm. But do not fall for that. Do not think that you are supposed to be morally led by politicians. Your morality should come from God and your faith, not from a person who talks about a country that will inevitably fail. Every kingdom will fall. As Christians, we know that every kingdom will fall. This earth will be nothing. It will be wiped clean one day, and every single person who has been misusing God's name will be held accountable. So it's irrelevant. That's not where our focus as Christians should be. I'm guilty of this. I get really caught up in the current political situations, and I have to keep reminding myself that this is not my home. This is not where I'm going to put my long-term stock, because it's inevitably going to crumble. And no one is above it. No one is more powerful than God. No one is going to outsmart God. You might be able to live 80 years of luxury on a crumbling empire, but it will inevitably fall. I'd rather have a tiny little house built on rock than a mansion built on sand. So I think we have to, and Jesus talked about this, pay to Caesar what is Caesar's. We have to do our part in society, but pay to God what is God's. And God is always going to trump. And if there's ever a time where you feel like you have to choose between the two, there is no choice as Christians. We are held to one master. You cannot serve two masters. God always comes first. Always. There is no choice. It's always going to be him. Be a citizen of this country and a good citizen, but don't make the government your God. You can read the ending. We know how it's going to end. Don't be deceived. Don't be fooled by false prophets. We see a lot of them right now. Churches shouldn't be endorsing candidates. They should be focusing on their communities, on their members, on spreading God's message. It's a great way to determine whether or not you're probably in a church that would give the formula to the mom who needs it or who would not. But using God as a way to make a gain politically, that's taking God's name in vain. That's idolatry dressed up as patriotism. And that's a problem. I'll be honest, I've been really caught up and wrapped up in the politics and the arguments. And I feel the outrage. I feel the adrenaline because I'm angry. I'm so angry, but I shouldn't be surprised that this is happening. This has been happening for generations, for centuries. Jesus experienced it himself. But I'm trying to keep myself centered and focus on what's really important. And I love the hymn growing up. You can have all this world, but give me Jesus. Take the whole world, but give me Jesus. I'll have my shack built on a rock rather than a mansion and a Mercedes and an airplane that's built on sand. My calling, I realize, isn't to rescue America's system, to change the political climate right now. My calling is to try to help restore Jesus's image, because I think it's getting lost in the wake of all of these things. It's being distorted by pride, by arrogance, by money, by wealth. And it's really easy to have all of those things drown out that still small voice. We have to set aside time where we're listening to that still small voice and we're reminding ourselves what's important and where our home is, and to not put your trust in brick and mortar. It'll inevitably let you down. You cannot put your trust in any man. You don't have to, though. Jesus came and died so that you don't have to put your trust in someone who claims to be representation of God and is just a false, whitewashed tomb. So, as a Christian, I also have been asking myself, what is my purpose in all of this? What is our purpose as Christians in all of this? And it is to stand up for God, restoring His image, His name, as it should be, and to help the people who are the victims in all of these headlines. Because these headlines, they're appealing, and it's easy to get caught up in it. And I've gone down many rabbit holes. I've found out way more than I want to know. And honestly, what I have found out has only furthered my belief that there is a God and there is evil, and they are in a battle right now, which the Bible talks about. And fortunately, I know who's going to win, but you can see that we're in the midst of that battle. And the Bible also talks about making sure that you're aware that that's going to happen and that you're grounded in the truth and the right side of all of this. So as Christians, I think we have to call sin by its rightful name. We have to call out these leaders. If you're a part of these churches who are doing this, call out those leaders. And if there's no change and they continue to do what they're doing, don't stay in that congregation. Leave, because you have more power as a congregation than you realize. It's called a church family for a reason. If you find out someone in your family is being hurt, are you going to stick around in that situation so that they can further get hurt? Or are you going to take them and you're going to follow them out to a safe place, a safer home, if you will? There's many good churches out there. I have been very blessed to have been a part of a really good church who took me in, who helped me, who brought me back to my faith when I was in a really dark spot. I made a lot of good friends. I met my husband there. There are good churches. You're going to find what you're looking for, but don't get lost in the noise because it's so loud and it's so easy to do. And I'm speaking from my own personal experience. So to be clear, this series is not about bashing the church. It's not about sensationalism. It's about confronting corruption head on the way Jesus did. Calling out the whitewashed tombs, exposing the spiritual abuse and manipulation, untangling Christianity from politics, which it's way too tangled right now, and restoring our role as Christians. It's time that we take back our power and continue on in the army of God. You can have all of this world, but I truly would rather have Jesus. All day, every day. So if you're ready to have an honest conversation, talk about the Bible, about cultural clarity, and regain a fresh look about who Jesus really is, feel free to hit subscribe and join me again next week for another episode of Flipping Tables.